Welcome back. We are in module 5 now, and today we will start with lecture 4 of module 5. We have been discussing language contact, the various reasons and the various impacts of language contact. In this lecture, we will look at bilingualism and multilingualism, that is yet another outcome of language contact. Almost a very common outcome. Before this we have discussed about pidgins and creoles. So, those are not very common. They arise in specific contexts of language contact, but bilingualism and multilingualism are something that are quite prevalent all over the world due to various kinds of contacts that people have formed for trade, for various other purposes and so on. So, that is the domain that we will discuss today. So, these are the topics, broadly the topics bilingualism and multilingualism, the reasons and the types, impact of bilingualism. One of them is code switching and code mixing. So, these are the things that we will discuss, and we will also look at the case of multilingualism in India, the specific case of India, because this is something very unique and quite different from other places, and it also gives us certain very interesting understanding about how language contacts and how languages, while they belong to different language families, they combine certain features, yet they keep their distinct identity intact and so on. So, that is why we will discuss case of multilingualism in India. Now, to start with, we often discuss about multilingualism and bilingualism as if it is something special, but often scholars have warned that this is not exactly a very special thing, this is actually the norm. In fact, some scholars have gone so far as to say that there are no truly monolingual speakers. So, monolingualism is actually not the norm. Even though this was considered to be the standard pattern, the norm, and bilingualism was considered the exception or the special kind of contact induced change and so on, but this is not really the case. One reason why monolingualism was considered the norm is because many western countries, specifically US and other such countries, are kind of monolingual, even though they were multilingual at some point of time, but the broader identity of these countries are typically they are monolingual. So, that has been the starting point for this kind of a notion, but if we scratch the surface a bit, we realize that even the European countries are heavily multilingual. There are many varieties of the same language, many different languages as well within the same country and so on. So, that is why scholars do not really agree that monolingualism is the norm. That is why Edwards says that there is no truly monolingual speaker, because people generally know at least some words or phrases from another language. Even if they do not speak more than one language, they will at least know some aspects of it. Similarly, other scholars more recently have emphasized that monolinguals actually is the exception, not the norm, and that most societies do have a history of multiple codes and multiple languages. So, individuals and societies use and have knowledge of more than one language, and this is the phenomenon called multilingualism. If it is two languages, we call it bilingualism, more than two we typically call it multilingualism. Trilingualism is also used when there are three languages involved and so on. So, languages are chosen according to the social domain. Now, in societies which use more than one language, how do you choose what language to use in which context? That depends on number of different factors. So, according to the social domain in which interaction occur. So, what are those domains? The typical domains, of course, they may not be the same everywhere in every country, but typically we look at the language used at home, then in the neighborhood, and different kinds of religious settings, another in the workplace, similarly many other. So, government and administrative scenarios will require the use of the standard language, religious context will may or may not, but typically it does require a specific kind of a code, linguistic code. At home we use the informal code and so on. So, depending on various scenarios, multilingual societies will utilize different kinds of either varieties of the same language or different languages. Now, some definition and some other aspects of bilingualism. So, who is a bilingual? When we say bilingual, take it as bilingual, trilingual as well as multilingualism. So, more than one language. So, who is a bilingual or who is a multilingual? The older definition of bilingual was somebody who has native like competence in both the languages. So, if I speak two languages, my L1 and L2, that is first language and second language, I should have native like competence in my second language as well. So, I should be able to speak English like the English does, the British does or the American does. That was the older definition of who is a bilingual. The research in bilingualism actually goes back a long time. So, over a period of time the definition changed, and now we for purposes of research we typically go by this kind of a definition, somebody who has minimal competence of a second language. So, you need not sound like or behave like a native speaker, but you should have adequate knowledge, that is enough. Adequate knowledge or minimal competence is something, the level of competence which will help you go, let us say you go to a new place where this L2 is spoken and you can go around. You do not have to write novels in that language, but if you have the capacity to carry on a day to day conversation, you are good to go. That is the working definition of bilingualism now. And also the definitions changed over a period of time. This also another domain that was very seriously taken. For example, all the 4 language dimensions. What are those 4? So, speaking and understanding as well as reading and writing. So, these are the 4 components of language. So, this was also considered important at one point of time, that you are one to be considered a bilingual, a proper bilingual, he or she should have competence in all these 4 domains. That is no more the case. Of course, if it is the case, you are near perfect, but it is not necessary for you to be called a bilingual. So, if you are able to speak and understand the second language, again good enough. So, that is how definitions have changed, but these are the primary domains on which the definition right now depends. And then we have levels of bilingualism. This is important because depending on the level of bilingualism, the research question and the approach of the investigation changes. So, individual versus societal bilingualism. Individual bilingualism basically talks about a psychological state of an individual who has access to 2 language codes to serve communicative purposes. So, at an individual level, now society can be bilingual. When the society is bilingual, individuals within that society will automatically be bilingual, but the reverse may not be true. So, some in a society which is largely monolingual, there might be individuals who are bilingual. So, that is why we need to keep these 2 things separate. So, individual bilingualism is when an individual is bilingual, which means that he or she has access to 2 different language codes. Societal, as the name suggests, 2 languages are used in a community. The entire community uses more than 1 language, and the number of a large number of speakers can use both. And then depending, there are multiple dimensions within which we understand and discuss and study bilingualism. We will discuss 6 of them. So, cognitive organization of the 2 languages. So, once you have learned 2 languages, how are they organized in your mind? Cognitively, what is the structure? So, depending on that, we have 3-way divisions of compound, coordinate and subordinate bilingualism. Compound is when one semantic system for 2 language codes. This often refers to a speaker who learns both languages at the same time in the same context. This is a compound bilingualism. Coordinate is 2 separate semantic system for 2 language codes, refers to one who learns the second language in a different context from the first language. Subordinate is the weaker language is interpreted in through the stronger language. Weaker language is typically the L2 second language, which is, so your proficiency in L2 is less compared to your L1. So, depending on the proficiency level, this often relates with the age at which you learn the languages. So, depending on that, this is compound is the highest proficiency, then comes coordinate, then comes the subordinate. Age of acquisition, if we take age as a variable, then we have infant learners and adult learners. This is self-explanatory. Sequence of acquisition, again Successive versus simultaneous. So, simultaneous is when the both languages are learnt at the same time. Typically, this correlates with early learners, infant learners, and successive is when you learn one language after another. On the basis of proficiency also, we divide them into two categories, balanced versus dominant. Dominant is one language dominates the other. So, one language has a higher proficiency compared to the other. Balanced is when you have comparable proficiency in both. And then depending on social status of their native language within a community, that also decides a division, a kind of a classification. So, we divide them into folk bilinguals versus elite bilinguals. So, folk bilinguals, these bilinguals belong to a minority language speech community. They often learn the dominant language of the society out of necessity, sometimes at the expense of their L1 prestige. So, in a case in a scenario where there are multiple languages, one language is the prestige variety. So, all the other speakers, all the other minority language speakers will have to speak that language. So, that is folk bilinguals. Elite bilinguals on the other hand, these are native speakers of the dominant language who choose to learn a second a minority language for additional cultural or social advantage, for other reasons, not out of necessity. Folk bilinguals, they learn the second language out of necessity, and for elite bilinguals they do not need to learn, but they might just learn for the sake of enhancing their knowledge. And then last, based on how the learning of L2 influences their retention of L1. So, while learning your L2, do you retain your L1 or does it replace your L1? So, depending on that, we have additive versus subtractive bilingualism. So, additive is when L1 remains and L2 adds to it, but when L2 replaces L1, this will be called subtractive bilingual. So, these are the different categories of bilinguals that are studied in linguistics. Now, there are different views about who is a bilingual and how does it really work in the mind. So, there are two ways of understanding this. One is the fractional view, the other is the holistic view. Fractional view says that a bilingual is equivalent of two monolinguals put together and entails parallel linguistic competence in both the languages. So, because there is an L1 monolingual and L2 monolingual, both are put together and then you become a bilingual. That is one idea. The holistic idea is that the bilinguals integrate the knowledge of and from both the languages and create something that is greater than each of the languages. It creates some sort of a meta system, meta language system. So, that is the holistic view. Now, in sociolinguistic studies, the multilingual societies are studied from multiple perspectives. Some of the parameters are here. These are the variables that often are studied. So, if a society is bilingual, what is the pattern of bilingualism? What are the domains of use, meaning which language is used in which domain, and over a period of time there is a chance that in the home domain you will typically use your L1, in the formal domain the L2 will be used, but in some cases in an advanced state of bilingualism the official language may come home and your L1, if it is not a very strong the vitality is not that high, then chances of L2 replacing the L1 also happens. So, domains of use at any given point of time as well as over a period of time. So, both synchronic and diachronic view of domain of use is one area of study. Then the choice of language, when you have a choice, when it is not forced on you, then how do the speakers behave? Do they choose to use one language because it is considered prestigious, or is it and sometimes they switch from L2 to L1 simply because they want to show solidarity. So, how does choice work in a multilingual society based on these kind of parameters? Function is of course one kind of fixed domain, because for formal purposes you have to use a particular variety. Typically we do not have much choice there, but in other cases there are other kinds of social variables that interact with the linguistic variables. So, in order to when you are not forced, what do you do? Do you switch to a particular variety to show status, or do you similarly do you choose to use another variety to show solidarity, politeness? There are multiple social variables that are at play. And then social factors affecting choice, various other social factors as well. So, the interrelationship between the communities which the languages represent, the various kinds of political realities, cultural realities, all these are important factors. And then all of these are bound together with yet another factor called attitude. How what is the both the intra and the inter group attitude is very important. So, within group, how do you look at your own language vis-a-vis the other language? Similarly, how does the outside group, the out group look at your group? So, all of these things are very important, subtle, under the below the radar kind of social variables that affect the domain of use and the result of multilingualism, bilingualism. So, these are various parameters. Of course, they are not as simple as they seem here. Each of them have multiple layers, but broadly these are the topics that we typically study. So, there are two hypotheses of bilingualism. Of course, one case of bilingualism is when you have the depending on the language type of language contact, it will automatically give rise to bilingualism. But then there are other kinds of bilingualism as well, because of which we have two different hypotheses. One is called the deficit hypothesis. Deficit hypothesis says that people use two languages because their own language or any of the languages, they do not have all the terms. There are lack of terms for certain conceptual categories. So, you need to take help from yet another language. This is very common in literature. In English literature, it is quite common to see the use of Latin expressions or French expressions. It almost seems like that particular concept that the author wants to convey, it is not very easily conveyed, at least not through a single word or a single phrase in English. So, but French has a ready reference for that. French has a nice phrase for that which fits the bill exactly. So, you take that French word and use in the English text. This is very common. Similarly, Latin. So, various kinds of Latin phrases are we do not even realize we are using Latin phrases now. They are very common in English. So, those are that is one domain, that is one hypothesis that has been talked about, that deficit hypothesis. The other one is called augmentation hypothesis, free will of speakers because of the creativity of the speakers. This is these are two domains that are two hypotheses, but beyond that also there are many other reasons. So, economic necessity, colonial history, and then identity, solidarity, and so on. Identity and solidarity we just talked about before. Economic necessity is often a very powerful indicator of whether a society will be bilingual or multilingual, or it will remain monolingual, depending on the reason, the language which is the ticket to economic economic mobility or higher economic status, and so on. One particular study talked about the savanna, the regions like savanna where trade networks require a lingua franca for survival itself, economic survival, that is. Colonial history, in many post-colonial nations, the colonial language has remained as the second language and often the official language. A case in point is of course India, where we are still using English in spite of having hundreds of languages. So, colonial history also has a very important role to play. And similarly, identity and solidarity, often we code mix and code switch between two varieties to signal certain social important variables. These are some of the attitudes that have been collected from multiple studies. Is it good to be a multilingual? Now, depending on where you are and who you ask, the answer will be different, and that tells us about the prevalent attitude in a particular community about bilingualism or multilingualism. As you will notice, there are contradicting variables, contradicting answers there. So, sometimes it talks about great prestige, but in some other cases they might just say it is a psychological handicap. If you have to speak two languages, that means you are not good enough. So, there are various depending on the society, depending on the cultural backdrop, the attitude might differ. So, basically this is a more of an emotional understanding than an objective understanding. Of course, in some cases like economic opportunities and educational opportunities, those are of course objective factors, but other than that, whether it is a status marker or it is a handicap, these things are emotional ratings rather than objective rating. And how do we know that? So, it is not bilingualism per se, but who are you talking about? That is what decides whether you call it good or whether you call it bad. A case in point is this. So, in the US, being a bilingual is appreciated if the native speaker speaks English. In that case, it is good. You are an English speaker and you learn another language, it is good, but the same feeling is not extended to those whose first language is not English. So, the Hispanics, for example, they are bilingual. So, their first language is Spanish and then various types of varieties of Spanish language, their L2 is English. So, in that case, it is not considered very good. So, those bilinguals are not understood or rated very high. Similarly, the idea of accent. So, somebody speaking with an Indian accent may not be found to be very sophisticated or very elite, but somebody speaking in with a French accent might be considered elite. So, these are basically emotional or often stereotypical way of looking at it. So, these attitudes, any study on attitude will tell us about the underlying socio-cultural constructs in that given society. In the Oriental nations, that India and other countries, things have been very interesting because these countries have been multilingual for time immemorial and they have remained multilingual, that is most important. Over a period of time, we have not become monolingual, we have remained multilingual for a very long time. And not only that, we already had multiple languages and then foreign invasions and colonialism brought even more languages. And as a result of which these languages have it is a potpourri of different languages and different kinds of constructs. So, this led to various kinds of changes in official language policies. Now, at ground level multilingualism in the native languages continued. So, while the official languages kept changing depending on the politics of the day, whoever is in power. So, when the foreign powers came in, we had different languages. So, official languages changed, but at the ground level native language multilingualism continued. One such important outcome of this is what is called linguistic area, which we will discuss in a different lecture. So, India has given rise to different multiple interesting outcomes because of the language contact scenario that has always existed here. So, linguistic area is one. The other outcome is what we call code switching and code mixing. This is a very common outcome of language contact, not only in India, but across the world. This is very common. And in fact, one recent study shows examples from children, teenagers, rap lyrics, text messages to demonstrate that code switching is a natural and widespread phenomenon across ages. It does not have to be only the young people or only in one particular domain that is used. It is quite prevalent, not so much in the formal domain, but everywhere else it is quite common in any society that is bilingual. So, multilingualism is considered to be a continuum of proficiency ranging from knowing a few lexical items to full fluency in several languages. And sometimes multilingualism also leads to language shift and eventually even it might lead to language death. This is something which we will again discuss in a later lecture. So, these are various kinds of outcomes of language contact resulting into bilingualism. So, languages coming into contact, remaining in contact, one of the outcomes is bilingualism, and because of bilingualism eventually there might be a shift and language death, but we will go there later. Right now, let us focus on one important outcome of bilingualism, which is code mixing and code switching. Now, code mixing basically it refers to mixing of linguistic codes. So, let us say a Hindi English bilingual will mix between Hindi and English, some words from here, some words from there. This is very common. So, then we mix lexical items, phrases, clauses and even sentences. At every level this mix is possible. Okay. Depending on which domain. So, there is CM stands for code mixing and code switching. These are common factors, and sometimes they are creative outcomes of bilingual interaction system, but often these are almost involuntary. This has become so common in the society that you do not even realize that you are using a code mixed variety. In India, a good place to find out the code mixing that is very common is the TV commercials. Even print media uses a lot of code mixed taglines for their products, because it is very catchy and it also reflects the way society is in general. So, code switching is usually intersentential. So, when within the sentence if you mix, then it is called code mixed. If the change is intersentential, that means it is not within one sentence, but the boundary is sentence. So, one sentence might be English, another sentence might be Hindi, that is called code switching. But often researchers use them interchangeably, both in code mixing and code switching are used for similar kind of structures. And so, these are some of the great scholars and their take on bilingualism and code switching. So, Weinreich describes bilingualism as the practice of alternatively using two languages, which basically in today's term it refers to code switching. Gumper states code switching is juxtaposition within the same speech exchange of passages. So, different scholars have talked about this, more or less they are similar, but over a period of time slight changes have happened. So, this is code mixing and code switching, though it is quite common, it is also strategic. We saw that social variables, cultural variables often interact with the bilingualism, the way which code you use, which language you use, and so on. So, one of those outcomes will be using code mixing or code switching as a communicative strategy. One very interesting example has been given by Janet Holmes in her book. So, in Mali, many multilingual societies, a choice of code is a marker for solidarity or status, social distance, right. So, status relations between people or the formality of the interaction. So, sometimes the conversation may warrant a change simply because of the topic. Now, this is a case where she discusses a person who has gone to some office he has gone to for tax related paperwork. Now, the person who works there is actually a neighbor of him. So, this is from Norway. There are two dialects, two varieties, but two varieties of Norwegian languages. One is a formal variety which is used for all kinds of official purposes, the other is a local variety. Now, typically the local variety or the vernacular variety as it is often called are used for solidarity. So, if you know somebody, you will speak in that language. So, we are from the same neighborhood and we share the language, we use that language. And then for a formal purpose we use the formal language. Now, this is a scenario where the setting is formal, but the relationship between the two persons conversing is informal, meaning they are from the same neighborhood, they are neighbors, they know each other very well, they know their families and so on. So, that gives rise to a very interesting exchange, where in the beginning, so Jan and Peter are talking. So, first couple of sentences they speak in the local variety as in the informal variety. How are you, how is your family, and somebody was not well, how is she doing now, and all that they ask, they talk. And then eventually they have to see in the mid sentence they change the code. So, now he talks about the exact purpose for which he has come to this office, and then he starts talking about the tax. So, do you think you could help me with this pesky form? Within the same sentence, he changes from the informal to the formal variety of the language, because the topic changed. When they were talking about family, how is your family doing and so on, local variety, and then as soon as he is talking about the actual work for which he has come there, switching to the formal variety. So, that is an interesting case where communicative strategy is one domain where code switching often has an interaction with topic. As a result, is very important. There is yet another example that Holmes gives. So, Japanese war brides in the US, for instance, found it easier to use Japanese for topics they associated with Japan. So, they have come to US as war brides to US, and now because of solidarity or for identifying with the Japanese culture, they use Japanese for certain words, but the rest is English. Similarly, Chinese students from one particular Chinese state, when they are living in a English speaking country, they speak among themselves in Cantonese. So, this kind of various kinds of interactions that we find in the studies. Patterns of mixing. Now, all code mixing are not the same kind. There are 3 different kinds of code mixing that scholars have pointed out. So, insertion, alteration and congruent lexicalization. We will not getting into the all the nitty-gritties, but these are different types of code mixing that have been pointed out. Now, the Indian story, let us look at the Indian bilingualism a little bit. So, code mixing and code switching have been always there in India, Indian scenario, Indian background. So, typically because most Indians do not speak only one language, at least they are bilingual, many of them are multilingual. So, this creative ability of a speaker to transition between 2 or more linguistic codes is quite common in Indian scenario. And this is this has also been called the Indian linguistic ecology, because this is very common because of the sustained contact between numerous languages over maybe thousands of years. We do not even know till from where the whole thing starts. So, in one way many scholars have pointed out that linguistic pluralism in India is slightly different from religious or cultural pluralism, because it involves sharing and functional use of use across languages, not just coexistence. So, it is not like only because they have been coexisting, but also there is a lot of sharing across languages that is quite common. Now, this as a result is also something, a very important pointer for linguistic identities, creating linguistic identities that are fluid. So, you can align them, in fact, this is also called bicultural bilingual. So, in Indian scenario where people are bilingual in their native language, not just in English, but also native languages. So, Bengali, Assamese, Tamil and Telugu, Malayalam, like this. So, and those people who speak these 2 languages often are also bicultural, they have lived in those different cultural settings. So, as a result the linguistic identities can be fluid in Indian scenario. So, this is another domain that has been that is now getting being studied. So, the dynamic identity construction reflects the sophisticated cognitive and social capabilities of multilingual individuals, specifically in case of societies like that of India. So, Indian multilingualism, there is a very brief overview of the history of it. So, it is not something very new. We have historical records of multiple languages coexisting in India for a very long time. So, historical roots we have, it goes back all the way to Atharva Veda, where which acknowledges that in one of the oldest Indian texts is Vedas. So, Atharva Veda acknowledges the coexistence of several languages and customs within the same territory. And then historical times also, during the historical period, we have long history of migration, trade, religious interaction and shared cultural spaces across thousands of years, at least hundreds of years in the historical time. So, during the BC 300-400 BCE, we do have records. In one of our previous lectures, we talked about the Indus Valley civilization having trade relation with Mesopotamia and other surrounding areas. So, that is how old that is 2000 BCE, depending on which theory you believe, but around 2000 to 1500 BCE. So, that is how old the interrelationship between different communities has been. In the ancient period, Panini himself wrote grammar by combining different varieties of Sanskrit spoken in the entirety of India. Ashoka's inscriptions also we have talked about before. Samrat Ashoka had issued edicts in multiple languages, and depending on the place, so in the eastern part they were bilingual edicts in 2 different languages. In the western part there were 2 different, yet another 2 different language, often the Aramaic script and the Greek and Sanskrit, Prakrit and so on. So, we have records from for a long time in India that historically it has been a multilingual country. In the medieval period, we do have records of the poets like Tulsidas and Vidyapati composed their poems in mixed registers using Sanskrit, Avdi, Maithili and Braj. So, this is a continuous tradition of multilingualism in India, And then in the modern time, because of colonial the impact and the other kinds of language and the resultant language policies, again it also had a role in shaping the multilingualism in India. So, we have all of these data points tell us that there is a large number of languages that are used in India for across the entire Indian territory. So, how do we understand this large number of languages coexisting? For classificatory purposes, we have a concept of language family. India has 5 major language families and there are 2 more that have been recently added. So, it is understood to be 7 language families that are found in India. So, many scholars actually say that the number may be 7, because now we have Andamanese as a separate family, we also have Taikadai as a family. The majority of Indian bilingualism is what is called the folk bilingualism, where the minority speakers learn the majority language because of simply because the majority language is the dominant language, that is one. And also the native bilingualism, where you speak more than one native language. English is a secondary choice in many cases. In the semi-urban and rural areas, it is not one of the important languages, it is the 2 local language or more than 2 local languages that people tend to speak. Now, the growth of bilingualism and trilingualism in India has been very steady and consistent over a period of time. This is some data that we have from the 1961 census to 2001 census. You can see a steady growth of bilingualism, starting with 9.7% to 24.79% in 2001. Initially, we did not have much data on trilingualism, but even when we did, there also you can see an increase over time. So, demographic patterns of multilingualism in India is also very interesting data to study. There are multiple angles to it. We have added a few. Speakers of non-scheduled or other languages are significantly more multilingual than those of the scheduled languages. India has scheduled, non-scheduled and other languages. So, typically languages in the lower in the hierarchy, that is the non-scheduled and other languages, they typically show more multilingualism than the scheduled languages. And the reason is easily understandable because of the folk bilingualism, they need to learn. Rural bilingualism, bilingualism is predominantly a rural phenomenon, unlike as opposed to what we typically tend to think that the cities are multilingual, bilingual. In India, rural bilingualism is also quite prevalent. Rural bilingualism, which stands at 51.63% as opposed to 48 of the urban areas. Trilingualism also is a very interesting area to study. The age distribution again. So, similarly among the illiterate population, female population outnumber males in terms of bilingualism, which is very significant data point for India. In contemporary, this is the latest census data that we have. Here also you can see the population share of bilingualism and trilingualism in different languages. So, basically this tells us that in case of India, bilingualism and multilingualism has been prevalent for thousands of years, and the trajectory of multilingualism even today shows consistent acceleration, because it is continuously, because now because of more and more what is called globalization, and then the internet and so many other new things have come into existence, and that has accelerated the pace of multilingualism in India. And the future projection is that by 2031 census, the half of India may become bilingual. And in terms of vitality, the data demonstrates that India's linguistic vitality is not diminishing, but rather evolving, with more citizens gaining competence in multiple languages while maintaining their mother tongue. This is one of the most significant aspect of Indian multilingualism, as I said in the beginning, that even though this country has been multilingual for ages, centuries, maybe a few thousand years, but we have maintained the vitality of most of the languages is actually quite high. Of course, some languages have become very small in number, speakers are less in number. Even then the picture is not as bad. So, this is where we complete this section. In the next lecture, we will take up yet another outcome of language contact. Thank you.